12 R&B groups. Groups you grew up loving, groups whose songs played at every cookout, every slow dance, every late night drive you ever took. Groups that felt like family. But here's what nobody told you. Behind every one of those songs was a story the world wasn't supposed to hear. Drug addiction, betrayal, exploitation, hidden illness. Men and women who gave everything and sometimes lost even more than that. You knew their music. Today, you're finally going to know their truth. Number 12, the Spinners. That's funny. You say that you are so helpless. Here's something that's going to stop you cold. The Spinners, one of the greatest soul groups of the 1970s. The group behind I'll Be Around, Could It Be I'm Falling in Love, and Rubber Band Man, spent nearly a decade at Motown Records doing everything except making music. No hits, no promotion, no priority. Just 5 incredibly talented men from the suburbs of Detroit sitting on a roster so stacked that Berry Gordy barely knew they were there. And here's what barely knew they were there actually looked like. Without hits to justify their contract, Motown put the Spinners to work, not in the studio, not on stage. As chauffeurs, as chaperones, as shipping clerks. You know what that means, right? These brothers, grown men who had been singing since the late 50s, were literally driving the Temptations around town, babysitting the Jackson 5, processing packages in a back room while Smokey Robinson and Diana Ross walked the halls. Think about that for a second. You've given 9 years of your life to a label, and they've got you mailing boxes. The one moment of real light came in 1970 when Stevie Wonder, who saw what Motown refused to see, wrote, "It's a Shame," specifically for them. It hit number 14 on the pop charts, number 4 on R&B, a genuine smash. And you know what Motown did with that momentum? Let their contract expire. Didn't fight for them, didn't invest in them. It was Aretha Franklin, not their label, not their management, who stepped in and told them to take their talents to Atlantic Records. And there, working with producer Tom Bell, the Spinners became one of the defining soul groups of an entire era. 11 consecutive top 10 R&B hits. Then Came You went all the way to number 1. The label they'd left behind, Motown quietly released a Spinners compilation to capitalize on their newfound Atlantic success. That's the music industry for you. They didn't want you until the world did. And honey, you'll always be the only one for me. Number 11, the Four Tops. There's a kind of loyalty that looks like strength from the outside and from the inside feels like it's killing you. The Four Tops, Levi Stubbs, Abdul Duke Fakir, Ronaldo Obi Benson, and Lawrence Payton had one of the most extraordinary runs in Motown history. Reach Out, I'll Be There. I Can't Help Myself. Bernadette. Songs that didn't just chart, they endured. The lineup never changed once in 35 years. 4 men, 1 unit, unbreakable. But in 1972, Motown made a decision that would test every bit of that loyalty. Berry Gordy was moving the label from Detroit to Los Angeles, and he expected his artists to follow. Most of them did, but the Four Tops, who had grown up in Detroit, whose roots were buried deep in that city, refused. And here's what that refusal cost them. They left Motown for ABC/Dunhill Records. And though they continued to record and tour with dignity, the truth is that without the full Motown infrastructure, without Holland Dozier, Holland crafting their songs, the chart success was never the same. The hits slowed. The crossover appeal they had spent a decade building began to fade. You know what's interesting? They had each other. All four of them, right up to Lawrence Payton's death in 1997. Duke Fakir, the last surviving member, has said that the friendship was the thing, that they were a brotherhood before they were a group. And I think about that sometimes. What's the price of that kind of loyalty? They stayed true to their city, true to each other, and chose authenticity over ambition. Some people would call that the wrong call. Some people would say they gave up the dream to keep the bond. I'll let you decide. Real talk. Only 9% of you are subscribed. That hurts. We're spending hours digging through archives, fact-checking every detail, bringing these stories back to life. And if you're watching this far, you clearly care. So hit subscribe. It's free and takes 2 seconds. Now, to my subscribers, barely any of you have joined the membership. And honestly, that stings even more. You know the work we put in. You keep coming back. If these videos have ever made you feel something, if this music means something to you, join the membership. It's $1 coffee a month, and it's the only way we keep this going. Let's build this together. All right, back to it. Number 10, Labelle. Picture this, is 1975. Lady Marmalade is #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. Patti LaBelle, Nona Hendrix, and Sarah Dash are on top of the world. Space-age costumes, groundbreaking sound, a message that wasn't afraid of anyone, and then a year later, it's over. LaBelle, the group, broke up in 1976. No dramatic announcement, no farewell tour, just done. And if you were a fan sitting at home with their records, you had no real explanation. You just knew that one of the most fearless, forward-thinking groups in R&B history had suddenly dissolved. What you didn't know was that behind those silver jumpsuits, the tension had been building for years. Nona Hendrix had a creative vision that was pulling in one direction. Patti was a vocalist who connected with the audience on a deeply personal, emotionally direct level. And Sarah Dash was caught somewhere in between. 3 deeply gifted women, 3 distinct artistic perspectives, all in a music industry in the mid-70s that wasn't sure what to do with any of it. Here's the thing that still gets me. Patti LaBelle has said in interviews that she felt blindsided, that she didn't see it coming, that when Nona and Sarah sat down to tell her it was over, she cried. She grieved it like a loss, because that's exactly what it was. If you've ever had something you poured your soul into fall apart, not because of hatred, but because the people involved had outgrown the container, then you know exactly how that feels. The world remembered Patti. Her solo career became one of the greatest second acts in music history. But LaBelle, the group, that specific alchemical combination of those 3 voices that only exists once. And it was gone before most people understood what they'd had. Number 9, the OJs. Here's a question. What do you do when you've been doing everything right for a decade and the world just hasn't shown up yet? The OJs formed in Canton, Ohio in 1958. Let that day sit with you. 1958. They were recording music before most of their fans were even born. They put in the years, changed their sound when the market shifted, stayed together when lesser groups would have quit, signed deal after deal, moved from label to label, and for years, almost a full decade, mainstream success stayed just out of reach. Then in 1972, Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff brought them to Philadelphia International Records, and Backstabbers, that swirling, ominous, lush masterpiece, hit number 3 on the pop charts and went all the way to number 1 on R&B. But here's what that triumph couldn't erase. The OJs were in their early 30s when they finally broke through. Eddie Leverett, Walter Williams, William Powell. These men had spent their 20s grinding, waiting, surviving on belief. And when the moment finally arrived, it arrived weighted with everything that had come before it. William Powell developed colon cancer in the mid-70s. He kept performing for as long as he physically could. By 1976, he was too ill to continue. He died in May of 1977, just 4 years after the breakthrough they'd all worked toward together. And Eddie Leverett, if you've ever listened to For the Love of Money or Used to Be My Girl and felt something hit you in the chest, you felt him. He would go on to lose his son Gerald in 2006 and his other son Sean in 2008. Some of y'all know that grief personally, and if you do, you know the music doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from somewhere deep. Number 8, the Isley Brothers. Let me tell you something about the Isley Brothers that most people don't put together. This group started in Cincinnati in the 1950s. Not the 70s, not the 80s, the 1950s. Hey, you've been good to me, baby. Ron Isley and his brothers O'Kelly and Rudolph were singing gospel as teenagers. Their very first major hit, Shout, came out in 1959. That's before the Beatles. That's before Motown even had a sound. And across the next 5 decades, the Isley Brothers charted in every single decade. The only act in history to hit the Billboard Hot 100 in 6 consecutive decades. This old heart of mine, it's your thing, that lady. Between the sheets, choosy lover. You know that song playing at the family reunion right now? Probably the Isleys. But in 2006, something happened that shook that legacy. I still remember when you used to be nice. Ron Isley, 65 years old, recovering from a stroke, battling kidney cancer, was sentenced to 3 years and 1 month in federal prison for tax evasion. 5 counts, $3.1 million in back taxes. The judge called it pathological tax avoidance going back decades. The IRS had already seized his yacht, his cars, his property back in 1997, and it had continued. Here's the part that nobody wants to say out loud. O'Kelly Isley, Ron's older brother, co-founder of the group, had died of a heart attack in 1986, and prosecutors alleged that Ron had been cashing royalty checks in O'Kelly's name, using a dead man's signature to keep money off the books. Whether you judge that harshly or understand it as the desperate act of a man who watched the industry chew up people like him for decades, that's between you and your conscience. Ron served 2 years. He came out singing. His voice was still there. Some things even prison can't take. Number 7, Shalamar. This one is going to hit differently if you've ever been told you'd be nothing without someone. Shalamar wasn't born in a recording studio. It was born in a conference room. Dick Griffey and Don Cornelius, the man behind Soul Train, needed an act to put on a record that was already made. They went to their own dance floor, literally. They pulled 2 dancers off the Soul Train stage, Jeffrey Daniel and Jody Watley, and built a group around them. That's the foundation. It's a manufactured act, which doesn't make the music less real. A night to remember. The second time around, dead giveaway. That's real, but it tells you everything about the power dynamic inside that group. When Jody Watley got pregnant in 1983, she didn't just face the normal anxieties of a young woman trying to figure out her next chapter. She faced pressure from the label, from management, from inside the group itself, not to have the baby, because the touring schedule couldn't afford it, because Shalamar couldn't afford it. Her pregnancy was treated as a problem to be solved rather than a life to be celebrated. And then came the argument in London. Howard Hewitt, the group's lead vocalist, told her, and he has since semi-confirmed this, that she would never be anything without Shalamar. She left anyway. She had her baby. She went solo. And in 1988, Jody Watley won the Grammy Award for Best New Artist. Think about that. John, the woman they said would be nothing, took home a Grammy. Hewitt, to his credit, eventually posted a public apology 40 years later, called it what it was, said some things needed to be said, but the scars from that kind of thing don't heal on someone else's timeline. Number 6, the Commodores. Girl, you know I've done all I can. Here's what the world saw in 1982. Lionel Richie going solo, leaving the group to make music on his own terms. Here's what the Commodores experienced. Their lead singer, their chief songwriter, their producer, their manager, and their entire commercial infrastructure disappearing. And not all at once, but slowly, over months of broken promises. The Commodores member William King gave an interview to the LA Times in 1985 that most people missed. He said, "We weren't mad because he decided to leave. We were mad at the procrastination. He never called up and said, 'I'm going over there.' Not one of the days that he promised to be back did he show up." Meanwhile, they couldn't book tours, because what promoter books the Commodores without Lionel Richie? King put it plainly. Would they book the Beatles without Paul McCartney? Richie was our McCartney. And here's the detail that rarely gets mentioned. And their longtime manager, the man King described as the glue that held everything together, died of a heart attack right around the same time Richie formally departed. So they lost their lead singer, their arranger-producer, and their manager essentially simultaneously. And they had to keep going with their heads up, because the bills don't stop. Yeah. They recorded Night Shift in 1985, a gorgeous tribute to Marvin Gaye and Jackie Wilson, and won the Grammy for Best R&B Song, their only Grammy. Won it without Lionel. The Commodores still tour to this day. Lionel Richie still plays their songs in his sets to roaring crowds, and some of the original members still haven't made peace with how it went down. I'm easy like Sunday morning. I understand that. When you build something with people, the ending writes itself into everything that came before it. I'm easy like Sunday morning. Number 5, Earth, Wind, and Fire. September, Boogie Wonderland, Shining Star, After the Love Has Gone. You know that feeling when Earth, Wind, and Fire comes on and the whole room changes? You felt it. Everyone in your life has felt it. That's not just music, and that's a specific kind of joy. Engineered and delivered by one of the most extraordinary musical minds in American history, Maurice White. And here's what Maurice White carried with him while he made all of that joy possible. In the late 1980s, Maurice noticed something was wrong. His hands, a tremor, subtle at first, then harder to ignore. He went to doctors. They told him what he already feared, Parkinson's disease. He was diagnosed in the early 1990s, and he told almost no one. He kept touring with the band, kept performing, treating his symptoms with medication, managing in plain sight for years. 5 years of performing with Parkinson's before he quietly stepped back from the road in 1994, telling people it was fatigue from 30 years of touring, which wasn't entirely untrue, but it wasn't the whole truth either. It wasn't until 2000 when Earth, Wind, and Fire was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame that Maurice finally disclosed what he had been carrying for nearly a decade. "I just got tired of not talking about it," he said. Think about what it means to keep a secret like that, to walk out onto a stage in front of thousands of people, to be the foundation of a band that gave the world this much beauty, and to know every night that your body was working against you while you smiled and kept going. He said he traveled with the band for 5 more years after his diagnosis. Medicated, present, determined. Maurice White died on February 4th, 2016, in his sleep at home in Los Angeles. He was 74 years old, and he never stopped being a musician. Number 4, the Gap Band. You already know the songs. "You Dropped a Bomb on Me," "Outstanding," "You Can Burn Rubber on Me," "Early in the Morning." If you've been to a black family gathering in the last 40 years, the Gap Band has been there, period. Charlie Wilson, Ronnie, and Robert, 3 brothers from Tulsa, Oklahoma, who named their group after the streets of their hometown: Greenwood, Archer, Pine. Seen him while that music was filling up dance floors and sound systems and car stereos across the country. Charlie Wilson was losing himself. In 1986, the Gap Band tried to renegotiate their deal to split their publishing rights from their manager, a reasonable ask. The manager's response, according to Charlie, was to drop them and then blacklist them, threaten labels, blocked opportunities, told anyone who would listen that the group was still under contract and untouchable. Here's what untouchable looks like from the inside. No income. Brothers drifting apart under financial pressure. Charlie turning to cocaine, then crack, then alcohol to numb what he couldn't control. By 1993, Charlie Wilson, the man whose voice powered one of the most beloved funk catalogs ever recorded, was sleeping on the streets of Hollywood Boulevard. In alleys, behind dumpsters, hiding during the day because he didn't want to be recognized. He told an interviewer that when friends or fans spotted him looking worn out, he would say he'd been up all night in the studio. His cousin finally found him, could barely recognize him at 130 pounds, and got him into a rehab program. There he met a social worker named Mahin. She became his wife. She helped save his life. If you've ever heard Charlie Wilson perform in the years that followed, if you've heard that voice, that joy, that fullness, you know what a comeback really sounds like. Number 3, New Edition. Here's a number that should make your blood pressure rise: $1.87. That's how much each member of New Edition, Bobby Brown, Ralph Tresvant, Ricky Bell, Michael Bivins, Ronnie DeVoe, received after completing their first major national tour in 1983. Candy Girl had gone to number 1 on the R&B charts, beaten Michael Jackson's Billie Jean, spent 18 weeks on the Billboard R&B chart. These were teenagers from the Roxbury projects of Boston who had just delivered a genuine smash hit record. And they came home to checks that totaled $1.87 each. The label, Streetwise Records, said the tour expenses ate up the revenue. That's what labels say when they've structured a contract so ironclad that a teenager who doesn't have a lawyer has no real recourse. Maurice Starr, the producer who had discovered them, had written and produced the album largely without them, walked away with the creative control, and went on to apply the exact same blueprint to another group of teenagers, white teenagers, named New Kids on the Block. New Edition was the blueprint, the original. And what they were handed in return for that blueprint was the closest thing to nothing that a number can be. They eventually sued. They eventually won their freedom from the contract. They eventually signed with MCA Records and built a legacy that still influences every boy band, every harmony group, every choreographed stage act that came after them.
So fancy, looks so sweet, she makes my heart just skip a beat.
But I want you to sit with $1.87 for a minute, and I want you to think about what it means when the system gets to decide what your talent is worth before you're old enough to know how to fight back. Some of y'all just got quiet. I hear you.
When you're with me, you're running out my day.
Number 2, debarge. The music was love, pure and simple. Rhythm of the night, I like it. Time will reveal. El DeBarge's voice, that impossibly bright, gospel-drenched falsetto, sounded like healing, like everything was going to be fine, and the truth was almost exactly the opposite. The DeBarge siblings, Elle, Bunny, Mark, Randy, James, Bobby, and Chico, grew up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, in a home fractured by a violent, abusive father and a childhood that left marks on every single one of them. They used music to survive. Church music first, then Motown-style R&B, then one of the most stunning pop runs of the mid-1980s. Berry Gordy once called Bobby DeBarge, their eldest brother, the founding member of the group Switch, the most talented artist he had ever signed. That includes Stevie Wonder. That includes Diana Ross. That's an extraordinary thing to say. And Bobby DeBarge died of AIDS-related complications in 1995. He was 39 years old. He had contracted HIV while in prison after years of heroin addiction that nobody talked about until it was too late to help. James DeBarge secretly married Janet Jackson in 1984. The marriage was annulled within a year, largely due to James's own battle with addiction. He later said she wasn't just his wife, she was his sister, his mother, everything. That's the kind of thing you say when you lose someone who was holding you together. By 1988, Chico and Bobby had been arrested for cocaine trafficking. By 1989, the group was done. El DeBarge, the voice, the face, the one Motown had quietly built the final album around because they were afraid of the other members' dependencies, spent the next 2 decades cycling through addiction, prison, relapse, and recovery. He called it 2 decades with a pipe in his mouth. What doesn't get said enough is this. Behind Rhythm of the Night was a family that had been through a war before they ever stepped in front of a microphone. The warmth you felt in that music was real. It was them reaching for something they desperately needed. The music's playing, a celebration starting. Number 1, The Temptations. 5 men, one of the greatest groups in the history of American music. And here is where the story ends. Otis Williams is the only original member of the Temptations still alive. Let that land. Melvin Franklin, Paul Williams, David Ruffin, Eddie Kendricks, gone. All 4 of them. And the way each of them left this world is a story that the music never got to tell, but the music made space for. Paul Williams, the choreographer, the showman, the heartbeat of the original group's stage presence, developed a severe alcohol addiction that everyone around him watched helplessly. By the early 1970s, he was so diminished that the group had a singer, Richard Street, standing backstage to sing his lines while Paul's microphone was quietly turned off. So audiences would hear the voice but not know, not yet. In August 1973, Paul Williams was found dead in a parked car blocks from Motown's Detroit offices. His death was ruled a suicide. But his family has always said the circumstances didn't add up, and the questions have never fully gone away. David Ruffin, the voice of My Girl and Ain't Too Proud to Beg, spent the decades after his firing from the group chasing what he'd lost and losing even more. He was fired in 1968 for missing a concert to watch Dean Martin's daughter perform. The ego, the cocaine, the repeated attempts to crash the stage at Temptation shows and take the microphone back from whoever was singing. A man who could not separate himself from the role that had made him. He died on June 1st, 1991, in a Philadelphia hospital after collapsing in a crack house the night before. Otis Williams saw him backstage in Las Vegas just months earlier, said David looked sunken and emaciated, knew what was coming. Eddie Kendricks died of lung cancer in 1992. Melvin Franklin, whose bass voice was the foundation of everything, died in 1995. And Otis Williams is still here, still performing, still carrying the name. I don't know if that's a burden or a mission or both, but every night he walks out on that stage, he's carrying 4 men with him.